9 years ago, this network contacted leading historians to assess American presidents, and we're doing it again in 2009 with 65 historians weighing in on the qualities and characteristics that identify our presidents, and rounding out the top 10 list, beginning with Abraham Lincoln, followed by George Washington. Number 3rd on the list of this leadership survey is Franklin D. Roosevelt, followed by Theodore Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. John F. Kennedy, number 6 in this survey, followed by Thomas Jefferson, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Woodrow Wilson, and Ronald Reagan. And then among the 42 men who've served in the White House, from George Washington to George W. Bush, the bottom 10, beginning with Rutherford B. Hayes, ranked at number 33, followed by Herbert Hoover at number 34, John Tyler at 35, George W. Bush is 36, Millard Fillmore is 37, Warren G. Harding is 38, William Henry Harrison, who served just a month, is 39, Franklin Pierce is 40, Andrew Johnson is 41, and James Buchanan is 42. Howard University professor Edna Medford is joining us here in our studio, and presidential historian Richard Norton Smith. We want to welcome our viewers as well, and we'll learn more about the methodology of this survey. But Richard Norton Smith, what surprises you?
What surprises me? Well, one thing doesn't surprise me. Bill Clinton moved up significantly from, I believe, 21 to 15. We can talk about it. I think there are a lot of reasons that contribute to that. That illustrates just how difficult it is to get a fix on a president who is still in office or who has just left office, particularly if he's a polarizing figure. The real surprise, I think, probably is U.S. Grant jumping 10 spots up to the middle of the pack. That certainly is at variance with what has been for 100 years or more the conventional thinking about the Grant presidency.
And Edna Medford?
I think what surprised me most, too, was Grant having moved up so significantly. And I am not sure exactly why that is. It may be that all of the press on Lincoln, especially because it's the bicentennial, has sort of elevated Grant as well because he won the war for Lincoln. Although we were supposed to have been looking at the administrations, ranking the administrations, I think we all realize that there are all of these residual kinds of things that come into play as well. It's not just about what these folk are doing as presidents, but what their careers were before as well. And since Grant was the person who won the war, so to speak, I think that because there's been so much talk about the Civil War and about Lincoln in recent months, perhaps it elevated Grant a little bit.
3 weeks ago, George W. Bush left the White House. Out of the 42 men who've served there, he is ranked at number 36. A ranking that includes what elements?
Oh gosh, there's a whole host of categories, including factors like public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, relations with Congress, vision, the ability to set an agenda for the country, the pursuit of equal justice for all. And then there's a kind of catch-all category called performance within the context of the times, which I think recognizes the fact that these are fluid and that the criteria that might apply to a 19th century president don't necessarily apply to a post-New Deal or a nuclear age office.
If you want to learn more about this survey, you can log on to our website at cspan.org/presidential survey. Rob Kennedy is C-SPAN's Chief Financial Officer and President, and to learn more about the methodology of this survey and also what was included, Rob?
Good morning, Steve. As you mentioned, this survey was conducted in a similar fashion to our 2000 survey. We asked historians and professional observers of the presidency to rate each president on 10 different categories of leadership. And 65 historians responded, and we've summarized all the responses on our website, cspan.org/presidential survey. In each category, historians were asked to use a 10-point scale, with 1 being not effective and 10 being very effective. So the maximum score for any category we then multiplied by 10. That was 100, and the overall maximum score was 1,000. We can look at the website, cspan.org/presidential survey. We've included our press release, also an expanded briefing that goes into some of the details. And we can look briefly at the presidents that came in between 11 and 32. 11th was LBJ. Very close between 12th and 15th. James Polk, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe, and Bill Clinton were the order. Then we go to William McKinley, John Adams at 17th, George Herbert Walker Bush at 18th, then John Quincy Adams and James Madison, followed by Grover Cleveland, Gerald Ford, Ulysses Grant, which we mentioned. Grant is up. You can see he's 23rd this time, 33rd last time. Then William Howard Taft, Jimmy Carter, Calvin Coolidge, Richard Nixon, James Garfield, Zachary Taylor, Benjamin Harrison, Martin Van Buren, and Chester Arthur round out the middle group.
Rob Kennedy, one of the headlines that will likely come out of this survey is the ranking of George W. Bush. So when they go onto our website, what will they find on our 43rd president?
Well, there is a page for President Bush, and within our expanded briefing, we've broken out his scores or his ranks in each category. We can make that full screen, and we can see that he was 36th in public persuasion. His top categories were crisis leadership, where he was 25th, and pursued equal justice for all, where he was 24th. However, in economic management, he ranked number 40, and in international relations, he ranked number 41.
And in terms of the largest move from the first time that we did this, Rob, in 2000 to where we are today, where did we see the biggest jump, one way or the other?
Well, the biggest moves in terms of overall rankings, the largest by far was Ulysses Grant, who jumped 10 spots from number 33 to number 23. But also Bill Clinton moved from number 21 to number 15. On the downside, Rutherford B. Hayes went from 26th to 33rd, Grover Cleveland down 4 spots, and also Woodrow Wilson. He stayed in the top 10, but he went down 3 spots from number 6 to number 9. And finally, Jimmy Carter was also down 3 spots from 22 to 25.
When C-SPAN first conducted this survey back in 2000, Professor Doug Brinkley led the effort. He is professor of history at Rice University in Houston and joining us on the phone. Doug, thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
What can the American people take away from this survey generally, and what can historians take away from it specifically?
Well, first off, it's fun. We were able to get a hold of some of the best presidential scholars in the United States, and we really tapped into a wellspring of smart people who have spent their lives going into archives and writing about presidents. And so we're very proud of the people that joined us at C-SPAN and participated in this. And it gives us a chance to talk about the presidency. We just saw how enthused America was about Abraham Lincoln's 200th birthday, and there Lincoln is on top of the list. But all these presidents have interesting stories. They have sites, birthplace sites, homes that they lived. Many of them are part of the National Park Service that people go to, and so we're hoping that people start talking about the presidency and trying to understand our history. It's a unique institution. I think it's the one that most people are interested in. The late historian Stephen Ambrose, I was once going to write a biography of a Secretary of State, and Steve said, write on presidents. People care about presidents. And I think that with a poll like this, it makes you start talking about just, what did Ulysses S. Grant do as president? Why would Rutherford B. Hayes fall some? Why is Warren Harding always on the bottom of the barrel? Why is Dwight Eisenhower up so high? And why is Lyndon Johnson seem to be, given the kudos? And sometimes these polls reflect the contemporary culture. There may be a moment right now that people are thinking that it's a deregulation period, or where we're looking for an activist federal government that's good at bipartisan relations. Lyndon Johnson did that with the Great Society, and hence you see Johnson up there higher than one might expect, which might mean there's a revisionism for Johnson in the air right now. So there are a lot of things that one gets from this, and it's a lot of fun, and hopefully people have conversations, and it's a way for tomorrow, for President's Day, for us to do something that's just not, a discount sales at local stores. Hopefully teachers might be able to talk about this, next week with students, and it's a handy tool, a way to get engaged in talking about presidents.
And as Rob Kennedy pointed out, Lyndon Johnson now at number 11. But one of the presidents that you did write about, Jimmy Carter, dropped from 22 to 25. Why?
I think because Bill Clinton has launched the Clinton Global Initiative and has kind of moved in, if you'd like, on Jimmy Carter's post-presidential turf is one reason, meaning Carter's... and then secondly, remember Carter, since our last poll, brought a book out that dealt with the issue of Israel, and he used the word apartheid in connection to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and that angered many people. Scholars like the lawyer at Harvard, Alan Dershowitz, went after Carter hard, wrote a book about him. And so some of the higher marks probably Carter got as the expert on Middle East due to the Camp David Accords probably gone down a few notches if people are frustrated that he wrote that book about actually using the word apartheid in connection with Israel.
Doug Brinkley, a professor at Rice University in Texas and leading the effort back in 2000 and part of this survey of American presidents, 65 historians, a cross-section of historians. Doug Brinkley, thanks for being with us for a couple of minutes.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's get to your phone calls. Your reaction to this survey and what it means for the American presidency. Indianapolis is first up. Good morning.
Good morning. It's me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. My thoughts are that it is just way too early for any historians to accurately rank our current president, our former president, George W. Bush, that it's going to take about another 30 or 40 years before we're really going to know, things that he had done on his watch and what has happened. For instance, everybody has forgotten about Iraq. They just recently had provincial elections. They were successful. All of the parties that had the word Islamic or Arab in them lost seats. All the parties that had Iraq and Iraqi gained seats. They've become a peace process in the Arabian Peninsula like we've had with no other event.
We'll get a response. Thank you for the call. Edna Medford.
The caller is correct. It may take several more years, maybe decades, to determine, for history to determine exactly what was going on with the Bush administration and how he ranks with other presidents. We need to remember that this is not a scientific survey. This is a survey of 65 people at a moment in time. This is just a snapshot. And we have to remember that every generation writes its own history. So in 30, 40 years, we might have a very different perspective of what happened during the Bush administration. And of course, it will depend on what happens in other administrations as well.
Elkhart, Indiana, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning. Hey, I got a question. When you did George Washington, do you count in before he was president of what he did or after he became president?
Thanks for the call. And actually, I'd broaden that out, Richard Orrin Smith, as you look at the totality of any one man who served in the White House.
Well, we ask everyone who takes part in this survey, and it's interesting because we just heard from Doug talking about the Carter post-presidency as influencing this, and that in some ways is unfortunate because what we try to do is, in fact, zero in on exclusively the period that these men served in the presidential office. Now, when you're talking about someone like a Washington or a Jefferson, or maybe even a Jimmy Carter, it's difficult, I'm sure, for some people to make that clean break. But we ask people, there's a reason they're called presidential historians, and we ask them to focus exclusively on the presidency.
Anderson, New Jersey, good morning to you.
Good morning to you all. Given the fact that the majority of Americans in the Gallup poll believe the Bush administration should be investigated for possible crimes committed with regards to three things. First, the use of torture, which is illegal and un-American. Second, the unnecessary deaths of over 4,300 Americans in Iraq and the injuring to close to 100,000 others. And last, the unnecessary deaths and injuries and trauma to over 500,000 innocent men, women, and children in Iraq. I wonder, at a cost of $3 trillion, by the way, excuse me, if you include the many wounded who will be having to be cared for generations to come, how he will rank. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think, as Edna said, the difficulty of taking a snapshot, particularly of a polarizing president, a controversial president, a president who in many ways represents a real break from, for lack of a better word, traditional policies. That is certainly the case with George W. Bush. If, for example, there are congressional hearings held along the lines that the caller suggests, if there are, in fact, legal prosecutions of anyone in the administration, that will obviously be factored into the process as it unfolds. On the other hand, if I was George W. Bush, I'd probably actually take some solace from the fact that his immediate predecessor jumped 6 spaces in the course of 8 years, or someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who famously in the Arthur Schlesinger 1962 survey was ranked below Chester Arthur, 23rd among all the presidents, and look where Ike is today. It just does illustrate how dynamic this process of assessing presidents is, and how much it's influenced not only by new information, but by different ways of seeing existing information.
So let's look at the top 5 on this 200th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. He is number 1, followed by George Washington. Franklin D. Roosevelt is 3rd. Teddy Roosevelt is 4th. Harry Truman is 5th.
Mm-hmm. These are crisis presidents to a certain extent. Lincoln will always come out on top because he's the person who preserved the Union. And so his place is secure. I don't think how many generations we're talking about he's going to come out on top. Washington, because he was the first president and set the standard for everybody else who followed. FDR, because of the Depression and the assumption that he got us out of that, however he did it, whether it was through spending, government spending, or through the war, and most historians would argue that it's the war that actually got us out. Teddy Roosevelt for having been engaged in trust busting and conservation, things that are dear to the hearts of Americans. And Truman because of the post-war era, the beginnings of the Cold War and so forth, things like desegregating the armed forces and that sort of thing. So these are people who we have a perception that there are certain American core values and that these people are upholding those values.
And even expanding democracy. Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting, 4 of those 5 have monuments on the Mall, or in the case of TR, he has his own island over in the Potomac. But each one of those, in their own way, defined and then expanded the notion of American democracy.
You have talked about crisis presidents, and you worked for former President Gerald Ford as the director of his library and museum. Where does his presidency lie in this, as somebody who was never elected and obviously wasn't elected in 1976 when he tried to run on his own term?
Well, I think he moved up 1 space in this survey. He's right around the middle, which is probably just about right, in my opinion. But there are some really curious anomalies. If you look at the internals, that's what really fascinates me. If you get away from the main number and you look at some of these internals, some of them really do sort of defy logic. For example, here's a great example. If you look at relations with Congress, okay, Gerald Ford finished number 13. And I think that reflects the assumption that most people have that Gerald Ford, after all, was a child of Congress. He spent, a quarter of a century on Capitol Hill. The fact is, he also issued more vetoes than any modern president. Most of them stuck. I mean, I don't think he would say he was number 13 in terms of relations with Congress. And that's just one small point. But I mean, I think there are a lot of those. If you look at some of the internals of these presidents, it's really almost more interesting than their overall ranking.
Rob Kennedy, let me go back to the website and also the methodology in terms of all of this, the characteristics that historians looked at in order to fully judge these presidents. What are they?
The survey asked historians to rate the presidents in 10 categories of leadership. And there are internal scores for each president on each of these 10 categories. They include public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, as Richard mentioned, relations with Congress, vision, setting an agenda, pursued equal justice for all, and then performance within the context of times.
And why did C-SPAN conduct this survey?
Well, we initially conducted the survey in 2000, not only at the end of the Clinton administration, but also at the end of our series on American presidents. We thought it would be good to go back at the end of the Bush administration in 2009 and update the survey to include the Bush administration, a first look at the Bush administration, but also look at any changes in attitudes or assessments that might have occurred in the past 9 years.
We are talking to 3 of the 65 historians involved in this process. Where can people find the full listing of all that contributed their expertise?
The listing of all the historians who contributed is on our website. If we go to the homepage, you can click on a link and find the list of the 65 historians.
Rob Kennedy, who's our Chief Financial Officer and President. We're joined here at the table by Edna Green Medford of Howard University and Richard Norton Smith, now historian in residence at George Mason University and former director of both the Ford and the Reagan libraries, among his other titles, and a contributor to ABC News. Baltimore, Maryland, good morning.
Good morning. I'm going to compliment you on a very, very good discussion. I hope that most people don't take this as some kind of a fact in the same way that the sun comes up in the east and that Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14th, 1865. I think it does prove one thing, though, that most historians tend to be liberal Democrats, and that's probably accounts for the fact that George H.W. Bush is so low and Bill Clinton has risen so much. I was also surprised when you had Harry Truman as number 5. I just wonder where he would have ranked had you run such a survey in 1953.
Which is an issue that you talked about earlier. Do you want to respond to the caller's point?
Exactly. I mean, as I said before, it really does matter how far removed we are from the times, what generation is assessing these people, and under what circumstances we're living at any given time. You know, it's easy to say rank these presidents according to their times, but all historians bring certain baggage to the study of history. We cannot forget our own times and the kinds of issues that we find important. In terms of who was involved in ranking these presidents, these presidential administrations, we did everything possible to try to diversify the pool. We looked in terms of political affiliation, or perceived political affiliation at least, gender, race, any number of factors. So we did the best that we could to diversify it, and I think if you look at the list, you will see that.
John Kennedy served 2.5 years in the White House, and yet he is number 6, higher than even Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, he moved up 2 spots in the last 9 years. Well, you know, it's fascinating. I actually think that one way of looking at this is Obama-centric. The fact is, this was done as in the immediate aftermath of this extraordinary and historic campaign that we've all been through. And for example, people keep making the parallels between John Kennedy and Barack Obama. The notion of generational change, the notion of stylistic and rhetorical change, the whole idea of renewal that Kennedy represented. I think there is some real nostalgia for the Kennedy years. And I also think that Kennedy has gone through a period almost of debunking. You know, at the time of the assassination, he was deified. And I think among the general public remained almost godlike for a long time. But historians, you know, they can't stand a consensus for forever. And so they began sort of debunking JFK and calling into question some of the things, even the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think we've gone through that cycle. And he remains, I think, with the general public, and as we can see now with academics, someone who in many ways is a role model for the modern presidency.
Herbert Hoover, number 34, getting a lot of attention as we look at the current economic situation and what he faced from 1929 until he left in 1933.
Yeah, well, he's a constant. He's, you know, poor President Hoover. He's doomed to haunt the lower rungs of the survey. The great irony is, if he'd been elected in 1920, when Franklin Roosevelt wanted him to run as a Democrat, he might very well be in the upper rungs of the survey. But a president, as Edna says, a president is very much a a creature of his own times and the consensus within which he operates.
Thomas Jefferson, number 7.
That was a surprise to me. I think there again, we're not just looking at the administration, we're also looking at the man holistically. So whenever we think of Jefferson, we think of the Declaration of Independence, we think of equality for all, even though he was a slaveholder. And certainly he's revered for having expanded the size of the country. He was involved in crisis situations as well, in terms of the Embargo Act and all of those kinds of things. But I continue to be surprised that he ranks so high. Especially if you're looking at him holistically.
You think it's sentimental?
I think it very much is. And it also suggests that American scholars are able to compartmentalize him. You know, perhaps they're able to look at the statesman separate from the private individual.
Edna Green Medford from Howard University and Richard Norton Smith here on our 6th floor studio, and in our newsroom is Rob Kennedy, who is tracking all of this on our website at cspan.org. Atlanta is our next caller. Good morning.
Morning.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I was calling about, I've been watching C-SPAN for quite a long time, and I've been watching Mr. Smith for quite a long time, and other historians. And one thing I've found, and some TV reporters, I've very seldom seen anybody have anything good to say about Bill Clinton. It's like he can't even put on a suit on, but when I look at his resume, he's a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Harvard, got a degree from Georgetown. I don't see no reporters or even Mr. Smith with a resume like Bill Clinton. But yet and still, they talk about him like he is, didn't know exactly what he was doing. He comes from a very poor background. And so what I really surmise all this is that if a guy can do this good, with everybody talking about him, history going to treat him very kindly. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the call. Before we get you to respond, Rob Kennedy, there is a comparison on the site from the first C-SPAN survey of 2000 to where he ranks today. Can you walk our audience through that?
Yes, we have a slide in our expanded briefing that outlines the changes in Bill Clinton's scores from 2009 to 2000. And as we mentioned, he was one of the big movers up. He went from number 21 to number 15. And if you look at the internals, you can see where those changes occurred. His total score went from 539 to 605, with large gains in relations with Congress, performance within context of times, also international relationship, and crisis leadership. And he ranks very high in economic management with the 77. He's actually 3rd among all presidents.
And yet Richard Norton Smith, one of 2 presidents to be impeached.
Yeah, but in my defense, I did say early on, I wasn't surprised that he moved up significantly. And I'll tell you a couple of reasons why I think that is true. First of all, if you remember back toward the end of the Clinton presidency, first of all, we were too close to the Monica Lewinsky business. And the further we get from that, I think we get a perspective that holds that to be less and less a significant factor. I mean, it tells you more almost about the political culture of the time than it does really about the Clinton White House. Beyond that, Bill Clinton's presidency was often criticized on the left within his own party as something of a missed opportunity. People saw this man with these extraordinary political skills, remarkable talents at communication, and they wondered why they didn't get more, bigger programs, bigger than the V-chip and school uniforms. But in fact, with the passage of time, the Clinton presidency appears to be more consequential than it did at the time. And also, Bill Clinton was the president who tried to move the Democratic Party to the middle of the road. And it's going to be fascinating to see how the Obama presidency plays out, whether in many ways the Obama presidency is in fact the next chapter of that process. And if so, and it's successful, Bill Clinton may rise still further.
And among the 19th century presidents, outside of Abraham Lincoln, who do you think were among the most consequential, the most important?
Oh, my goodness. Jackson, probably, because at least the perception is that he helped to expand democracy to the common man. And in terms of the power of the presidency, it definitely was Jackson. In terms of moral authority, no, he would rank near the bottom because of his whole association with Indian removal and so forth. But certainly in terms of expanding the power of the presidency, he would be considered the most consequential, I think.
Did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, no, I would agree with Jackson. I mean, he redefined the presidency, and actually, after the first 6 presidents, who were well-bred, well-read, of the Virginia dynasty and 2 Adamses, Jackson represented symbolically the expanding frontier, and in the context of his times, a more democratic approach to political policy.
James Buchanan at the bottom.
Well, it's interesting. We've got the same Holy Trinity at the top. They never change. And the unholy Trinity, I guess, at the bottom of Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and Franklin Pierce, with Buchanan at the bottom. And isn't it interesting that the greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, follows the worst president, James Buchanan? I don't think there's an accident.
New York City. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Scully. Brian from Inwood.
Hi, Brian. Quick question, please.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of time, that's why, but I appreciate the call.
Yeah, all right, Scully. Well, okay. First of all, I agree with the first caller. It's too soon to judge George Bush. I also agree with another caller that said a lot of these professors come from the left, and therefore we're not going to get a fair shake from them.
Well, let me take that point, and we'll come back and follow up.
Well, again, I would suggest, as Edna has, go online and actually take a look and see who participated in this survey. I know for a fact, because I spent a lot of time working on this, we made a very concerted effort to make sure that, quote, conservatives were included, and I think we did a pretty good job. But again, you be the judge. Take a look at the list of participants.
And Rob Kennedy, do you want to list some of the individuals that participated in this for us?
Well, I'll just point out that the list of survey participants is linked right from the homepage of the website, and rather than read any specific ones, I mean, some of these are relatively well known: Alan Brinkley, H.W. Brands, James Cannon, but we really did try to strive, working with our advisors for the survey, to have as broad a cross-section of historians, a diverse group among all different criteria to participate in the survey. And I think an analysis and looking in at this list will show that we did well in that regard.
And we'll go back to Brian, a regular caller. We always welcome your calls. Did you want to follow up?
Yeah, did C-SPAN conduct this survey?
Well, we contacted the historians.
All right, if you guys were involved, then I'm going to trust you, Steve, because I trust C-SPAN to be fair. Okay, Ronald Reagan. I thought Ronald Reagan should have been third. I think I would put Washington first, Lincoln next, and then Ronald Reagan. He had that moral authority. He had tremendous courage. He was a great president. He ended the Cold War. He began a good fight against the left-wing culture that's nearly destroyed America. And I also think George Bush is going to come out very well in 20 years from now. We ought to, as one caller suggested, take a look at Iraq. It happens to be doing very, very well. It was George W. Bush that freed millions and millions of people, unlike the left, the kind of sick, twisted idea that he murdered people and all that. No, he freed the country.
I'm going to stop you on that point. Thank you for the call. And we should point out that you worked at the Reagan Library, the Ford Library, the Hoover Library. You worked for Senator Bob Dole. So you come with this experience of dealing with
and let's not forget Lincoln. The Lincoln Library.
And the Lincoln Library. Yeah. What haven't you done?
Anyway, well, the caller, it's interesting because Ronald Reagan is another example. When Ronald Reagan left office, and this is often the case, presidents in some ways are at the nadir of their reputation. Maybe they've sort of worn out their welcome. There's fatigue or something. But historians tend to not know quite where to put them. And the story of Ronald Reagan's post-presidential reputation has been one of steady improvement to the point where he is, I think for the first time now, in the top 10.
Our next call is from London. Go ahead, please.
Oh, hi. Yes, I just want to say that Abraham Lincoln, definitely from an international point of view, was a great president. There's no doubt about that. The second thing I want to say is that for George Washington, I'm surprised he's number 2, but I'm not surprised also again because he was an Englishman anyway. And also again because of the fact that he had no political party in American politics. But the one thing I'm surprised about is that John Quincy Adams wasn't put in the first 4 because he was that president that despite the fact that he was a president and he lived in London anyway, he went back as a congressman and he actually defended the rights of slaves.
We'll ask Rob Kennedy in a moment about John Quincy Adams, but Edna Medford?
Well, starting with Adams, he wasn't seen as very effective. He wasn't very popular during his own time and hasn't been very popular since then either. The whole moral authority piece certainly does elevate him quite a bit, but that's something that happens after he leaves the presidency, and it doesn't seem to have a tremendous bearing over his overall scores. In terms of Lincoln and Washington, absolutely, Lincoln is highly regarded internationally. Washington, as I said before, ranks highly because he was the first. He could have been king had he chosen to be, but he went in another direction, and I think that Americans will always praise him for that, and scholars certainly do take that into consideration when they're ranking him.
Again, Rob Kennedy, using John Quincy Adams as just one example, when they log on to the site and learn more about individual presidents, what will they see with this man?
Well, we've pulled up the page for John Quincy Adams, and on a page for any president, a user can see not only his total score, and in John Quincy Adams' case, he ranked 19th in both 2009 and 2000, but also the inside scores for the 10 different categories of leadership. And we can see quickly that John Quincy Adams ranked highest in Pursuit Equal Justice for All, where he was 11th, but he ranked lowest in Public Persuasion, where he was 31st, and also Relations with Congress, where he was also 31st.
And Richard Norton-Smith, he of course had a post-presidential career still in politics, as did William Howard Taft, the only president to serve in the U.S. Supreme Court as Chief Justice.
Yeah, but William Howard Taft didn't have Steven Spielberg make a movie about him. And who can factor that into the presidential rating system? Anyone who's seen Amistad has to come away with a higher view of John Quincy Adams than probably members of his own cabinet. He was, like his father, a better statesman than a politician. He was a party of one who I think reached towering heights as a congressman from Massachusetts, fighting against the gag rule and in effect fighting the abolitionist cause. But as Edna points out, that didn't transpire during his 4 rather unhappy years as president.
We're talking about C-SPAN's second historian survey of presidential leadership. Our next call is from Muscatine, Iowa. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I had 2 quick questions. First of all, since Watergate, Nixon's been dead for a while. How do historians view Nixon today on his foreign policy? And second, if Abraham Lincoln, let's say, would have lived, do you think the American people after the Civil War would have supported him on Reconstruction? Thank you.
Thank you for the call, Edna Medford.
The Lincoln, if Lincoln had survived beyond the war, what we know about Lincoln is that he was a very cautious individual. And we do know that he had already started a plan of Reconstruction before his death. He did have a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction as early as 1863. And we know that that was a very mild conciliatory plan toward the South. There would have been radicals in Congress who would have objected to that mild conciliatory policy. Whether or not they would have been as effective as they became under Andrew Johnson is questionable. I think that Lincoln might have been able to get them to come around. If that had happened then, I doubt seriously if we would have seen the 14th and 15th Amendments passed as early as they were. And in terms of the Nixon presidency and how it's ranked in terms of foreign policy, I believe he's at 11, so he's looking pretty good.
Next call, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments to make here. I identify myself basically as a Ronald Reagan Republican, so naturally I'm going to say Ronald Reagan was the best president ever. But I wanted to make a couple of comments about George Bush. I think the survey that's being taken here, in a way, it kind of reminds me of a thermometer. It seems like it's more of an indicator of how people are feeling in the country right now. And as far as George Bush goes, I think it's just way too soon to make any big moral judgments or judgments about his ability or the rightness or wrongness of what he did.
Well, I think the caller has a point, as we've addressed a couple of times now this morning. The fact is, particularly for a president who arouses strong emotions, pro and con. Richard Nixon used to say it would take 50 years before anyone could write objectively about him. Who knows about George W. Bush? But as Edna said, there are policies that President Bush set in motion that are obviously still playing out. We literally will not know for some time to come. If we have anything like a stable, quasi-democratic Middle East 30 or 40 years from now, then I guarantee you he'll rank very differently.
You mentioned the HBO documentary on John Adams and his family, and John Quincy Adams. A lot of focus on David McCullough's book on Harry Truman. Was that a turning point in a historian's revision of his presidency?
Well, it was sort of the frosting on the cake. Harry Truman really came into his own in the mid-'70s as against the backdrop of Vietnam and Watergate. Harry Truman came to be seen as the real deal, someone who was authentic. As our politics became increasingly dominated by spin and artifice. I mean, Truman famously said, "I wonder how far, that Moses would have gotten if he had taken a poll about where to go." Well, I mean, there was a sense that Truman was confronted with a host of incredibly difficult decisions that defined the shape of our world, and certainly the Cold War, for half a century to come. And so I think Truman's importance and Truman's attractiveness as the little man from Missouri, so-called, the guy who never forgot where he came from and went home to independence and really went into obscurity for the last 20 years of his life. And it was only after his death, when measured against the political culture as it had degenerated, that Truman was dusted off and seen in a very different light.
And Rob Kennedy, Edna Green Medford was talking about some of these categories, international relations being one, and a president's relations with Congress as another. Can you elaborate on that?
Posted as part of our expanded briefing slides that get into detail on both international relations and all the 10 categories of leadership. So with respect to international relations, George Washington was number 1, FDR number 2, Lincoln 3rd, Truman 4th, Teddy Roosevelt 5th. We also list the bottom 5 presidents, and we've listed who has shown the biggest gains in score since the 2000. And some of these are significant. Bill Clinton up 10 points. I think other changes are not quite as significant. So users can go into our website and pull up any of these 10 categories. And here's relations with Congress, where FDR is number 1, LBJ number 2, and pull up these individual categories and look at the internal numbers.
Poor Millard Fillmore.
Well, he's not complaining. He never expected to be president in the first place. You know, there's a group that gathers in the cemetery in Buffalo every year on Millard Fillmore's birthday to celebrate Millard Fillmore, who is really famous for his obscurity. But you can make a case. Millard Fillmore is actually one of the most important presidents in American history, because when Zachary Taylor died in July of 1850, he made it clear he wasn't going to approve the Compromise of 1850. Millard Fillmore succeeds Taylor, and he says, "I will approve this compromise," which in effect bought 10 years for the North to develop industrially and otherwise before you had the final military showdown over slavery. So if Millard Fillmore hadn't been there, American history would have been very different.
Here's a look at the bottom 10, beginning with Rutherford B. Hayes, Herbert Hoover, John Tyler, George W. Bush, and Millard Fillmore, followed by Warren G. Harding, William Henry Harrison, Franklin Pierce, Andrew Johnson, and James Buchanan. Germantown, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I want to try to do this rather quickly so I can get some comments.
Certainly.
First of all, I think there's something called the presidential glam factor, certainly for the 20th and 21st century. Sometimes I don't think people are what they appear to be. It's how they've been made by the media consultants that advise them. And I feel that way about Ronald Reagan. I've never felt that Ronald Reagan was the president that everyone thinks he was, which will lead me to the second point that I wish y'all would look into. Presidential cabinets are very interesting because the agendas of the members of the presidential cabinet and also the vice president I will name Dick Cheney. I've often thought of Dick Cheney as being more the president than I did George W. Bush.
Did you want to respond to that?
Yes. You're absolutely right. Perception is everything. Perception is reality in this instance. And so how a president is made in terms of what the media thinks has a tremendous influence, I think, on Americans in general. I don't think it has quite that influence on scholars, however. We tend to delve deeper than the surface, at least we should be. And in terms of Reagan, I think he scores so highly because he was a great communicator. He was able to get his point across to the average American, whether you agree with him or not. He certainly was able to do that. And the second part of your question, I sort of missed. So
we're going to go on to Costa Rica for a caller waiting. Good morning to you.
Good morning from Costa Rica. And how soon we forget, Ronald Reagan committed adultery with his first wife, Jane Wyman. And when Nancy Reagan and he got married, she was 5 months pregnant. How soon we forget. And Steve, you don't put up the outside the U.S. number, the telephone number on the screen as often as you used to in the past. There's millions of us live outside the USA because I left the USA when George Bush was appointed by the Supreme Court. So please include the...
Good point. We'll do that. Thank you very much. Appreciate the call from Costa Rica. But let me ask you about the
By the way,
personal...
none of those alleged crimes occurred during the Reagan presidency.
But the personal characteristics, whether it's John Kennedy or Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, these personal traits as you weigh the totality of the individual?
Well, there are presidents that are simply unforgettable figures. They are indelibly part of our popular culture. Teddy Roosevelt is still selling coffee and teddy bears, 100 years after he was president. There are presidents who are swashbuckling, colorful, dynamic. They define the age. There are arguably 3 presidents who have their name on an age, Jackson, FDR, and Ronald Reagan. So there's no doubt that there are, this is a story, American history. And there are some more vivid characters. Millard Fillmore really doesn't have a leg to stand on compared to an Andrew Jackson or a Teddy Roosevelt.
Boca Raton, Florida, you're next.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Caller, you need to turn the volume down on your television set.
Good morning. Yes, I have it on. Good morning. I have a question.
Okay, caller, I'm going to put you on hold. We will come back to you. Turn the volume down. Fresno, California, you're next.
Hello?
Fresno, good morning.
Good morning. Yes. Yes, I had a comment regarding George Bush. They're saying that you have to wait 20 years, 30 years to find out, how they rate as president. And I would like to know if you could have Vincent, it's Bugliosi. The book is called The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. It says it has all the evidence in here of everything he's done, and I have not heard anything regarding this at all, period.
What about the rawness of the emotions of the Bush presidency?
Yeah, we are just weeks actually, away from the Bush administration. It is much too early to make any kind of judgment. He was a president that really did polarize the country, and so you're going to have people who are just as positive about his administration as you have who are rather negative. We're going to have to take some time, and we're going to have to weigh the evidence, but it is much too soon right now.
We're going to try to go back to the caller in Boca Raton, Florida. Still with us?
Yes, sure.
Much better. Go ahead with your question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for taking my call. I would much be interested in the opinion of your esteemed participants about Jimmy Carter's administration. Being of Russian origin, I know very well history of invasion of Afghanistan. And I know, my opinion is that Carter kind of allowed Brezhnev to enter Afghanistan, and that created all sorts of problems for the next 30 years, being that birth of Osama bin Laden and the whole Mujahideen movement and the whole psychotic Muslim movement. So I would be very much interested in your opinion how it affected economic situation back then and for the next 30 years and pretty much our lives even as of today.
Richard Norton Smith.
Well, it's interesting. Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 because people wanted an outsider. They wanted someone who wasn't representative of the Washington culture. And ironically, those very qualities came back to haunt him during his presidency, and particularly when he ran again in 1980, when they decided they wanted another outsider in the form of Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter will always be associated with the Camp David Accords, the most significant step forward in terms of peacemaking in the Middle East. I think there is also probably a consensus that he didn't work very well with a Democratic Congress, that his people never really meshed with the Washington culture, and that therefore the Carter presidency perhaps didn't achieve as much as it might have. One last point, however, Jimmy Carter was ahead of his time in recognizing that the New Deal was over and that the Democratic Party had to find a way to appeal to the vast majority of Americans who are comfortable ideologically in the middle of the road.
Next call from Chicago. Good morning.
Yeah, first I'd like to respond to some of these off-the-cuff comments made by some of these callers. And then I'd like to ask a question. First of all, I'm really fed up with these people, basically right-wingers, calling in, talking about, well, the media is against us and the educators are all left-wing and liberal. Well, they need to think about something. The media, people in the media, what are they? They're informed. The people, such as yourself, historians, professors, are educated. The more educated you are, the more informed you are, the more likely you're going to be toward the liberal persuasion. You're not going to be one of those people that could be fooled all the time.
Did you want to respond to that?
Okay, I don't know what I'm responding to exactly. It was more a comment than a question. I think that there is room for all opinions. We cannot just assume that one perspective is correct. And so we need the conservative views as well as the liberal views, and perhaps we will be able to reach a happy medium if we consider all of those.
Rob Kennedy, again, going back and as a comparison to what we saw in 2000 to what we're seeing today, you talked earlier about former President Bill Clinton having one of the biggest shifts. Who else made some significant changes, either up or down?
Well, the biggest move, either up or down, was Ulysses S. Grant, who improved from 33rd to 23rd. And the biggest move down in the rankings was Rutherford B. Hayes, who dropped to number 33. Most of the other presidents stayed within one or two of the ranks that they had in 2000, although it's interesting to look at some of the internal numbers for each of them. And that's why on the website we have what we call an expanded briefing, where our viewers can go in and look at the numbers on each of these specific categories and look at some of the moves that are there.
Atlanta, you're next.
Hi, I have a question about George W. Bush. If President Obama proves to be weaker on national defense than President Bush was, and if this should lead to a major attack on U.S. soil, will that change the public's opinion of Bush? How will history view him? Will he get a bump from Obama's failures, do you think?
Which goes back to a point you made earlier, Richard Norton Smith. Did you want to respond first?
All of these presidents are ranked. They're not ranked in a vacuum. You know, they're ranked based on what other administrations have done. And you're absolutely right. There might be some change of opinion with Bush being shifted upwards if we are attacked again. I think there's concern as well over the economic issue. If the stimulus package, for instance, does not work, or does not work as readily as we might hope, then there might be, I don't know, I don't know if that would benefit Bush or not. But certainly we do look at these administrations with all of the others. We're not looking at them in a vacuum.
And the best evidence of that, again, is look at how Bill Clinton, 9 years ago, Bill Clinton, in effect, was running against himself. Now, Bill Clinton is judged in the context of the 8 years that followed him. And I think that's a significant reason why he has bumped up significantly. That certainly was the case earlier with Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman, who came to be seen not within the narrow context of their own times, but in terms of what followed them. And they looked a whole lot better than they did at the time.
let me conclude with the individual who leads the list 200 years after he was born, 16,000 books later on Abraham Lincoln. What more could be said or written about our 16th president? We'll begin with you, Richard Norton Smith.
As long as people in this country or around the world grapple to define a new birth of freedom, whatever it means for them and for their time, then the last word will never be said about Abraham Lincoln.
He perceives, he epitomizes what we perceive as America's core values. Integrity, honesty, perseverance toward honorable goals, compassion, all of those things. And as long as we define our nation by those standards, Lincoln is going to be at the top, and people are going to continue writing about him. Even though there are 16,000 books out there, there will be 16,000 more.
And Rob Kennedy, this network is all about education, so when folks log on to the website and learn more about this presidential survey, what do you hope that they'll take away from it?
Well, I think it's just a great window into our history. There's so many ways to look at this data, to learn about presidents that are both well-known and more obscure, see how they rank, try and think about why the rankings may have changed. So we hope that this becomes a great educational resource for students in school and students of history.
Rob Kennedy, who's C-SPAN's Chief Financial Officer and President, thanks for being with us. And our two historians here at the table who helped us with this survey, Edna Green Medford of Howard University and Richard Norton Smith, thank you for your work in this effort, and thanks for taking our viewer calls today.
It was fun.
Pleasure.